There's something mystical about IEMs. I mean, how is it possible for dozens of IEMs to be released every month, and what type of magic do $2,000 IEMs hold within their tiny enclosures? All kidding aside, IEMs are a cheap way to experiment with your music. You can find tons of affordable IEMs under $100, some with wildly different sound signatures and performance. You also don't have to pay several hundreds or thousands of dollars to get luxury IEMs. Sometimes you get great bargains that out-luxury the luxury brands. Today, we are going to take a look at the KBEar Aurora. This is a $170 IEM from a company known principally for its affordable gear. An online retailer called Keep Hi-Fi sent me the Aurora to review. Keep Hi-Fi contacted me several months ago and offered to collaborate. Always willing to try new things? I said yes. Keep Hi-Fi has a growing list of Chinese audio gear. Check out their website if you're interested in fancy audiophile bling. So, what about the Aurora? Is it as poetic as its name? KBEar promises that the Aurora will have a dark background. I assume they mean that we should not hear hiss or signal noise, but I can't be sure. KBEar's marketing says that this IEM has improvements in the vocal, high-frequency extension, and sound details. Further, they claim that the Aurora gives listeners the immersive experience and quietness of listening to the sounds of nature, which is also the origin of the name Aurora. Apparently, the Aurora is supposed to be an impactful IEM, providing impactful lower end, rich vocal clarity, and highly detailed instruments. In fact, KBEar repeatedly says that the Aurora is a clear-sounding IEM. A lot of the marketing is vague and mystical. All we know is that KBEar thinks that the Aurora will sound clear. KBEar suggests that the Aurora will have a balanced sound signature, but that's something we're going to have to discover. The Aurora is made of metal. It has a standard IEM design. While it is not a true custom IEM, specifically shaped to your ears, the cone-shaped design should suit most people. The Aurora is smooth to the touch. You can see a seam joining the two portions of the housing. This seam runs the circumference of the IEM. This IEM comes with a nice assembly of accessories. You get a sturdy carrying case, a 2-pin cable, 8 sets of ear tips, and a cleaning cloth. All these accessories seem well built. The cable is nothing special, but is fairly thick and sturdy. It does transmit some microphonics if rubbed against clothing. It's nice to get an assortment of ear tips. Some of them have wider bores, which will impact the sound signature. All the ear tips are silicone. As for comfort, I think the Aurora is easy to wear. It's not heavy. It does not sit flush within my ears and tends to jut out just a little. However, the Aurora never fell out of my ears, even with rigorous head shaking. I can wear the Aurora for 3 hours before needing a break. Overall, the Aurora has good build and decent accessories. This is generally the number and type of accessories we see in products within this price range. However, we have also seen this type of stuff with cheaper IEMs. Sometimes, on the other hand, it's really difficult to get even this much with IEMs that cost $700 or $800. So, way to go, KBEar. I tested the Aurora using my RME 80i2 DAC, my Modi Liquid Spark stack, and the Lotu PAW 6000. I used the stock accessories. I used the white silicone ear tips that were pre-installed on the Aurora. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The Aurora is easy to drive. While I used fairly expensive sources, this IEM doesn't need a special amp. Feel free to plug these into a 3.5mm jack in your mobile device, assuming it still has one. The Aurora displayed a very slight amount of hiss when music was not playing. This will depend entirely on your source. I barely heard it on the RME 80i2 DAC through the 1/4 inch out, and I did not hear it at all through the RME 80i2's IEM out, and I also didn't hear any hiss through the RNHP. KBEar says that the Aurora has impactful bass. My tests indicate that this IEM has a slightly emphasized bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a low rumble from the beginning of the track. The Aurora was able to present this detail. It seemed a bit emphasized, more so than what I heard on the neutral Moondrop Quarks. The bass transients was about average, similar to what I heard on the Quarks. Mid-bass impact was hard, but not sharp. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass was similar to what I heard on the Quarks. In other words, there was some melding. When the crescendo hit, the organ seemed clear and was easily discernible from all the other instruments. In Conquer, by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This is supposed to pan from right to left to center. The Aurora rendered this detail perfectly. There are multiple drums in this track, and the IEM presented all of them. There was marginal melding between one drum strike to the next, but no muddiness. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, Upatech, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the Aurora presented the sub-bass without difficulty. It seemed to be slightly emphasized compared to the Quarks. The subwoofer sounded like it was about, 5 feet away. The drums were a little louder than the sub-bass. Vocals were always one step ahead of the bass instruments. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I use these songs to determine if there is audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, the Aurora never audibly distorted. Overall, it seems that the Aurora has a bass emphasis. It's not aggressive, but it's also not neutral. Sub-bass is probably several decibels above neutral. Mid-bass is closer to neutral, though still a bit emphasized. The marketing says that the Aurora has rich vocal clarity. My tests indicate that the mids are a little forward and somewhat sibilant. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there's vocal grain and sibilance mixed in. The Aurora seemed to keep the vocal grain neutral. However, Orla's sibilance was noticeably emphasized. It was greater than what I heard on the neutral Moondrop Quarks. The sibilance was not, to my ears, harsh or piercing, but it was indeed elevated. The drums and guitar melded slightly with each other but did not sound muddy. The drums were a little louder than the guitar. Orla's voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. In Want You Back by Haim, the Aurora again showed that it marginally emphasizes female vocal sibilance. The emphasis was not piercing, but evident. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary vocalist says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The Aurora perfectly presented this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The Aurora initially rendered their voices separately. When the instruments played at maximum, I could just barely hear the individual voices of the backup vocalists. When these instruments played softly again, then the separation returned. The drums, guitar, piano, and bass all melded a little with each other. The drums were slightly louder than all the other instruments. The vocalists were typically 2 steps ahead of the instruments. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the Aurora clearly presented the ukulele, drums, and bass. The drums were a little louder than the ukulele. Their primary male vocalist sounded clear, and his voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance was slightly elevated. There is a backup vocalist in this track, and that voice is layered beneath the primaries. The Aurora could not present this minute detail, a lot like many other IEMs and headphones. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The Aurora clearly rendered this detail. Overall, it seems that the Aurora has forward mids. Vocals generally appear 1 to 2 steps ahead of instruments. There is a slight emphasis in sibilance. Separation of mid-centric instruments is about average. KBEar doesn't say much about the treble response. My tests indicate that the Aurora has close to neutral treble. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the Aurora clearly presented the brass and horns. Their nasally signatures were obvious. The higher pitch notes appeared to have a slight emphasis, maybe by a few decibels. This was a marginal deviation from the more neutral Moondrop Quarks. There was about an average amount of separation among the group sets with minimal melding among them. The timpani was a bit emphasized, but never drowned out the other instruments. The Aurora presents width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, instruments appear closer or further away in the wings and deeper into the well, as if in an orchestra arrangement. However, sounds do not come from above or below. In Flight from the City, the Aurora made the piano sound like it was about 6 feet away. The bassy notes were slightly emphasized, but not muddy or distorted. There was some melding between one note and the next. I could clearly hear the pops and sizzles and the electric buzzing effects. The cello sounded smooth and melded marginally with the piano. I could hear the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 of the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the Aurora rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and the bass 1 step behind. The drums were a little louder than the saxophone. The saxophone's higher pitched notes seemed to have a slight emphasis, but never became harsh. Separation among instruments was about average, slightly better than what I heard on the Quarks. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities. The Aurora did clearly render these minute differences. Overall, the Aurora seems to have a marginal emphasis in the upper treble region. It is not far from neutral in my opinion. There is at least average clarity and separation in this region. No instrument sounded harsh or piercing, even at high volumes. KBEar says that the Aurora is supposed to excel at detail retrieval. The marketing says that the instruments are highly detailed through this IEM. In my experience, I think the Aurora is a fairly clear product that presents at least average detail, if not a bit more. The bass is not the clearest portion of this IEM. Consequently, bass detail, whenever it might be present in a track, is not this IEM's forte. However, separation in the mids and treble frequencies is fairly obvious. This results in obvious details jumping out and some subtle and sometimes minute details appearing occasionally. Pops and sizzles, electric buzzing, multiple vocalists, sharp intakes of breaths, creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, twangs of guitar strings, varying tonalities of cymbal strikes, these details are patently obvious on the Aurora. I have a quantitative test for detail retrieval. I use Kazuki's song New Light, which has layers of details. This includes the sound of wind, rustling of grass, children playing, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Heidi's MS2 presents 8 to 9 footsteps. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and the T2 Evo present 7 to 8. The Moondrop Aria presents 7. The T2 Plus and the Blonde BL05 present 6 to 7 footsteps. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6. The The Audio Legacy 2 provides 6 to 7. The Moondrop Quarks, 5 to 6. The Blonde BL03, 5 to 6. And the Aurora rendered 7 to 8 footsteps. For my detail and resolution scale, I use the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Any IEM that provides more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Thus, on my scale, the BL03 would be considered below average, and the T2 would be above average. Here, the Aurora presented the amount of detail similar to that of the T2. In other words, it is above average in detail retrieval and clarity. KBEar doesn't say anything about the soundstage capacity of the Aurora. I don't think the Aurora breaks new ground. In fact, the Aurora presents vocals and instruments fairly close to the ears. There's average to maybe above average separation of instruments. As with my detail test, my soundstage test also has a scale. For the sake of comparison, let's talk about the soundstage of other IEMs. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and Heidi's MS2 have above average soundstage. The Blonde BL03 and the BL05S are average at best, and perhaps slightly below average in soundstage based on proper fit. The Starfield, Aria, Quarks, and Peacock Flight are average. After repeated comparisons, I have to say that the Aurora seems to have average soundstage that is similar to that of the Aria, Starfield, and Quarks. It is, in other words, about average. The Tin T2 has wider soundstage. I wish IEM companies would spend less time using confusing poetic language to describe their products and more time telling us what the tuning actually is. It gets rather frustrating to figure out what these guys are talking about. Luckily, KBEar gave us a hint buried in their marketing. Among all the other jargon, the marketing says that the Aurora supposedly has a balanced sound signature. I think that's a fair description, though I would add a caveat. I think the Aurora is balanced with a lean towards bassy. The bass is elevated, sub-bass has a noticeable emphasis above neutral tuning. Mid-bass has a marginal emphasis in comparison. There is some melding between these regions. The bass tends to bleed slightly into the mids. The mids are forward. Vocals are close to the ears and generally stand about 2 steps ahead of instruments. Male and female vocalists get a slight emphasis in sibilants, but nothing that appears harsh to me. The treble is close to neutral, with a slight emphasis in the upper treble region. There is good clarity and separation in this region. No instruments ever sounded piercing, even at high volumes. The Aurora has above average detail and clarity and about average soundstage. So, yes, I would say that generally the Aurora has a balanced sound signature, but the emphasis on the bass is noticeable. I'm sure some people will call the Aurora a bassy IEM, while others will say it's balanced. But I'd be surprised if anyone said that it was neutral or flat. I think the fair assessment is to call the Aurora's tuning W-shaped. Changing ear tips will affect the sound signature, so if you use foam ear tips or some alternative types of silicone tips, then your experience will be different. Whether you end up liking this IEM is something only you can decide. I think it's important we continually do A/B comparisons among products. Hyped products rarely deserve the overwhelming praise they receive. Only after several years in the market with thousands of user reviews do we get a more accurate view whether a product is hype-worthy. Unfortunately, that's not reality. Here, we will compare the Aurora against the Moondrop Aria and the KBEar Diamond. I use the stock accessories for all these IEMs. I plugged them into my passive AB switch. That switch was plugged into my Army 80i2 DAC. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. And of course, I tried to volume match. The Aria and Aurora have similar bass response. Both are elevated. However, the Aurora seems to have more emphasis in sub-bass. The difference here is by several decibels. It also has slightly longer transients. There's marginally more separation of sub-bass from mid-bass on the Aria. Mid-bass impact is slightly harder on the Aurora. The mids are a little different. The Aurora has slightly forward mids, the Aria has somewhat recessed mids. Both accentuate vocal sibilance. Both appear to have a similar amount of sibilance emphasis. Vocals appear a little closer to the ears on the Aurora, while on the Aria, vocals typically are about one step behind the drums. There's a bit more clarity in the mids region on the Aurora. The treble is, again, a little different. The Aurora has a slight emphasis in the upper treble region. The Aria seems to have a slight emphasis in the mid-treble region, but a roll-off in the upper treble region. Going back and forth, you can hear that the Aurora places a bit more emphasis in the higher-pitched notes. The Aurora has a bit more treble clarity. The Aurora has a bit more detail retrieval and clarity, but has about as much soundstage as the Aria. The Diamond has slightly less sub-bass emphasis than the Aurora. The difference appeared to be marginal but present in an A/B test. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass was slightly greater on the Diamond. Transients was about the same. Mid-bass impact was very similar, but I think the Aurora has a bit more of it. The mids are noticeably different. The Aurora has forward mids while the Diamonds are recessed. The Aurora has a slight emphasis of sibilance. The Diamond did not appear to add any emphasis. Vocals stood out in the mix more obviously on the Aurora. The Aurora had more clarity in this region. There's a big difference in treble response between these IEMs. The Aurora has a slight emphasis in the upper treble. The Diamond has a noticeable roll-off, particularly in the mid-treble area. Higher pitched notes were sharper and clearer on the Aurora. Separation of treble instruments was more obvious on the Aurora. The Aurora overall has slightly greater detail retrieval and clarity. In my new light test, the Diamond rendered 5 to 6 footsteps compared to the Aurora's 7 to 8. The Aurora appeared to have wider soundstage than the Diamond. Comparisons like these help us determine where products fit into the ever-growing list of IEMs. Sometimes companies release products with minor deviations from the previous versions. In those instances, it might not be worth spending money for minute changes. Other times, there are noticeable alterations that people have asked for, and thus the newer product might be worth considering. Here, the Aurora is no doubt a bass-emphasized IEM, just like the Aria and Diamond. But as we have learned over the years, saying something is bassy is pretty vague. You have to compare to figure out how bassy a product actually is. It seems that the Aurora has more bass emphasis than the other two products I compared. The differences are not night and day, but they are present in an A/B test. The Aurora edged out the others in clarity, separation, detail, and placement. This, of course, does not mean that the Aurora is better than the Diamond or Aria. Rather, all three have differences. While they share a bass emphasis, they don't have the same mids or treble response, and consequently, they don't sound exactly the same. Ultimately, you will have to decide if any of these might suit you. There are so many IEMs that it's really hard to figure out where to put your money. If you're new to the IEM world, then it might feel tempting to buy the most expensive product you can afford under the belief that the higher the price tag, the better the sound will be. Price has little to nothing to do with sound quality or sound signature. That's a fallacy companies are happy to propagate. But you'll have a frustrating time finding an IEM that suits you because of the vast number of options. The Aurora adds to that confusion. Here, you have one more option among the multitude of others. The Aurora has a balanced sound signature. The bass is emphasized, the mids are slightly forward, the treble has a push in the upper treble region. This IEM produces above average clarity and detail and about average soundstage. It seems to me that KBEar has tried to achieve something similar to the Harman target. When I compared the Aurora to the Aria, there seemed to be commonalities between them. Yes, they sound different, but it appeared to me that the Aurora's tuning was following a similar path, shall we say? If you find that the Harman target shrouds vocals but generally like the rest of the tuning, then the Aurora might be an interesting product. On the other hand, if you want an aggressive V-shaped signature, the Aurora might not be for you. This brings us to value. At $170, the Aurora is at the edge of what I would consider value. It's a bit expensive for what you get. There's probably another IEM somewhere that sounds very similar to the Aurora, but I don't have it in my collection. So, at least for me, the Aurora presents a unique tuning, though not a huge deviation from what we've heard before. The Aurora has excellent build, quality accessories, and a tuning that is generally clear, detailed, and bassy. Is it value? Arguably, yes. In my opinion, the Aurora probably offers a modification to the Harman curve. Those who want a bit more bass, clarity, and vocal separation from the typical Harman target might be able to justify purchasing the Aurora. And those who want something different from what they already have, well, the Aurora is a good IEM for you to consider.